When Jonathan White, a successful millionaire, encountered an old woman outside his home, he had no idea that her words would turn his life upside down. She revealed a shocking secret. He had a son who grew up in poverty without a father. This unexpected revelation would force Jonathan to reconsider everything. You won't believe how quickly things can change, but let's start from the beginning. Jonathan White, the embodiment of success, was known in New York as a talented businessman, billionaire, and a man who had achieved everything through sheer perseverance. His home, located in an exclusive suburb and surrounded by high fences and security, was the epitome of safety and stability. Luxury cars in the garage, a personal chef, and endless invitations to exclusive events, all of this made his life the envy of many. On the surface, Jonathan had it all: money, status, a thriving company, and a beautiful wife, Laura, who often graced the covers of magazines at glamorous parties. But behind this perfect picture, problems were brewing. Despite her outward smile, Laura was deeply unhappy. Her only desire, to become a mother, remained unfulfilled. For years, she had spoken to Jonathan about how they were ready to start a family, but each time he postponed the discussion, citing business or complex projects that demanded his full attention. He convinced Laura that starting a family was too big a responsibility and might interfere with his career. The tension grew, and Laura became more distant from him. One evening, after the successful completion of a major deal, Jonathan came home expecting his usual routine. As he approached his house, he noticed a figure near the gates. From a distance, it was clear. A frail old woman in tattered clothes was sitting on the steps of his luxurious home. She looked entirely out of place in this neighborhood, her weathered face and worn coat starkly contrasting with the mansion's gleam. What is she doing here? Jonathan thought to himself, feeling a twinge of irritation. People from the street were strangers to him. Individuals he rarely interacted with unless it involved charitable events. He occasionally attended to maintain his public image. As Jonathan stepped out of his car, the old woman raised her eyes to meet his. There was something in her gaze, not just a plea for help, but something more, as if she knew him. Her hands trembled, perhaps from the cold or from nervousness, and her face bore the weight of years of hardship. "How can I help you?" Jonathan asked curtly, trying to remain polite, though there was a cold edge to his voice. "My name is Mary," the old woman said softly. "I didn't come to beg for money. I came to tell you the truth, something you should have known a long time ago. What I'm about to say might destroy your life, Mr. White." Her words felt like a thunderous warning. At first, Jonathan wanted to dismiss the conversation. Stories like this seemed to him like fantasies or scams. He was about to call security, but something deep within him made him pause. A strange feeling crept into his heart, as if the woman really knew something important, something from his past. "Go on," he said quietly, though internally, a sense of unease was growing. Jonathan stood frozen, stunned by the old woman's words. Everything he thought he knew about his life suddenly seemed to crumble. He took a few steps back, as if trying to physically distance himself from what Mary had just revealed. His eyes darted around, and his mind raced to find some explanation. For a moment, he couldn't respond, simply staring at her, unable to believe what he had just heard. "What did you say?" he finally asked in a strained voice, feeling his anxiety growing. Mary sighed, as if the words she was about to speak were a burden she had carried for decades. Then, looking him straight in the eye, she began to speak. 25 years ago, when you were not the man you are today, you had a brief relationship with a woman named Karen. You were young, ambitious, just starting your career. You may not even remember her, but for her, it meant everything. Karen got pregnant and had a boy, your son. She never told you because you were too consumed by your life, your ambitions, and your career. She didn't want to interfere with that. Jonathan shook his head, unable to believe what she was saying. He tried to recall the woman Mary was talking about, but his memory offered nothing clear. Perhaps there had been a fleeting encounter, a short affair, but he had never imagined it could lead to something like this. "That's impossible. If I had a son, I would know," he said. but there was already a hint of doubt in his voice. Karen never wanted to tell you. She was afraid you would reject both her and the child. After her death, I, her mother, took responsibility for your son. I didn't come here to make you feel guilty, but to tell you the truth. You have a son, Jonathan, and he needs you. The old woman handed him a tattered envelope, inside of which were photographs and letters. Jonathan took it mechanically, never taking his eyes off her. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope and began to pull out its contents. The old photos showed a young woman, Karen. Seeing her face stirred distant memories, like a foggy fragment from his past that he had long tried to forget. Soon, his eyes landed on another photo. A boy, around 10 years old, with dark hair and large brown eyes. He was the spitting image of Jonathan as a child. The realization pierced him to his core. "This can't be," he whispered, feeling a wave of reality crash over him. His doubts mixed with pain, creating a turmoil within. But there was more. Inside the envelope were several letters written in neat handwriting. These were Karen's letters, addressed to Jonathan, which she had never sent. In them, she described her life, her pregnancy, the birth of the child, and her fear of how he might react to the news of having a son. Every word in those letters cut through Jonathan like a knife. He couldn't believe that he had lived in ignorance for so long. His life, once so controlled, now seemed like an illusion. Everything he thought he knew about himself was now in doubt. "I need to verify all of this," he said, looking at the old woman with a trace of skepticism, though deep down he already knew she was telling the truth. The next morning, still grappling with the harsh truth, Jonathan began to act. He couldn't just sit, consumed by shock and guilt. In his life, there had always been one guiding principle. If there's a problem, it must be solved. No emotions, only calculation and a plan. This was how he had built his empire, and now he would apply the same approach. However, this time it was much more complicated. This was not about business, but family. He quickly contacted a private investigator he had trusted for years, tasking him with finding out everything about his possible son. Within just a few days, the investigator provided a detailed report. Jonathan's son, Andrew, was a 24-year-old man living in a modest apartment on the outskirts of New York. He had grown up in poverty, barely finished school, and had been forced to work several low-paying jobs just to make ends meet. The more Jonathan learned about Andrew's life, the deeper his guilt grew. He couldn't believe he had allowed his son to live such a life. Deep down, he felt responsible, even though he knew that at the time of those events, he simply wasn't ready for the responsibilities of family life. But that didn't absolve him of his duty. When the investigator informed him that Andrew worked at a gas station, Jonathan decided to go there in person. The drive to the outskirts was heavy, and with every mile, the weight on his chest grew. He watched as skyscrapers disappeared, and luxury neighborhoods gave way to run-down buildings and gray streets. The world he was entering was completely foreign to him, and this world was his son's life. When Jonathan arrived at the small gas station, he saw a young man, unaware of his approach, fixing something under the hood of an old car. His hands were covered in grease, his clothes dirty, and his face exhausted. Jonathan stood frozen, seeing before him a young man who, with every passing second, felt more like a part of him. In his features, Jonathan saw his own reflection. The same jawline, the same eyes. Summoning his courage, Jonathan stepped out of the car and walked toward him. "Andrew?" he said quietly, trying to keep the tremor out of his voice. The young man turned and gave him a displeased look that was instantly filled with suspicion. He didn't know who this man was, but something about him stirred an instinctual dislike. Perhaps it was the very instinct developed after years of living in harsh conditions, where every stranger could bring new problems. "What do you want?" Andrew asked curtly, wiping his hands on his clothes. Jonathan didn't know how to start this conversation. He had prepared for it, but now all his words seemed meaningless. He felt like an outsider in the life of this young man he should have been a father to. "I need to talk to you about your mother," Jonathan said cautiously, trying not to alarm him. Andrew tensed, his eyes narrowing. He was used to people mentioning his mother only in a negative light, as if her poverty and struggle for survival were something to be scorned. "What do you know about my mother?" he snapped. His voice was laced with pain, and it stirred something deep within Jonathan. I knew her, and—" Jonathan took a deep breath. "I'm your father." Those words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Andrew stood there, stunned, his hands dropping, and his face twisted with shock and disbelief. "What?" he whispered, and then, realizing what was happening, his face contorted with anger. "You're my father! Where were you all this time? Where were you when I needed you? When my mother died, when I was living on the streets? You, my father!" His voice rose to a shout, filled with rage and pain. Jonathan couldn't find the words. He hadn't expected this meeting to be easy, but now, standing before him, was not just his son. There was an entire life of suffering that he was indirectly responsible for. Andrew didn't want to accept him, and Jonathan couldn't blame him. "I didn't know I had a son," Jonathan said, but his words felt hollow to Andrew. "You didn't know? You live in your huge house with all your money and opportunities, and you didn't even know you had a son." Andrew couldn't hold back his emotions. "I don't need your excuses. I don't need you in my life." Those words cut through Jonathan like a knife. He felt everything collapsing. He had hoped to make amends, but now he realized that the path to reconciliation would be much harder than he had imagined. Meanwhile, Laura couldn't help but notice the strange changes in Jonathan's behavior. He had become distant, often leaving in the evenings without explanation, and his gaze was more often lost in thought. It had troubled her for a long time, but recently her anxiety had grown. She felt that her husband was hiding something, and it was eating her up inside. One evening, when Jonathan returned home late, the tension in the house reached its breaking point. Laura was sitting in the dimly lit living room, waiting for him. As soon as the door closed behind him, she stood and approached him without a word. "Jonathan, what's going on with you? You're not the man I married. You're always leaving. You have secrets. I can't take it anymore." Her voice trembled with emotion. Jonathan knew this conversation was inevitable. He was tired of hiding the truth, but didn't know how Laura would react to everything he had to say. He looked at her, searching for words that could explain everything without causing more pain. But there were no such words. "Laura, I need to tell you something," he finally said, taking a deep breath. "It's about my past and my son." Laura froze in place. She looked at him in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. "A son? What son?" she asked, fear and confusion swirling in her mind. Jonathan began to tell her everything. About the old woman, Mary, who had appeared on their doorstep, about the secret that had been hidden for decades, and about the fact that he had an adult son, Andrew, whom he hadn't known existed. With each word, Laura became paler, her hands shaking, and tears began to well up in her eyes. "You're telling me you have a son? And you've known for some time but didn't tell me?" Her voice quivered with outrage and pain. "All this time I've been dreaming of having a child, hoping that one day you'd be ready. And you already have a son I didn't even know about." Jonathan tried to reach out to her, but Laura stepped back, as if recoiling from his betrayal. "Laura, I didn't know. I only found out recently," he started, but she cut him off. "That doesn't matter, Jonathan. You lied to me, you kept this from me, and now you expect me to just accept this. That you already have a family, and I'm— What? Just an accessory to your life?" Her voice broke into a shout, tears streaming down her face as she couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. She felt her dreams of a life with Jonathan shattering. All these years, she had hoped their marriage would one day be filled with joy, that they would have a child to bring them closer together. But now, her dreams had turned into a nightmare. Jonathan was already a father, and that was too much for her to bear. "I don't know how to live with this," she said, her voice shaking with helplessness. I can't live with the thought that you chose someone else, even if it's your son." Jonathan saw her pain, But he also knew he couldn't abandon Andrew. He had already made the mistake of not knowing about his child once, and couldn't allow himself to make it again. Laura, I love you, but I can't abandon Andrew. He's my son, and I have to help him. I know this isn't fair to you, but I can't just forget about him. His voice was full of despair. Laura looked at him as if he were a stranger. Her heart was broken, and she could no longer endure the lies and betrayal. I can't do this anymore, Jonathan, she whispered through her tears. I'm leaving. With those words, Laura headed for the door. Jonathan stood there, unable to stop her. He knew he had destroyed everything between them, but he also understood that in this moment, nothing could change the situation. Part 5. After Laura's departure, Jonathan's home fell into silence. The spacious rooms, once filled with warmth and life, now seemed cold and lifeless. Everything he had built, his career, his wealth, his comfort, suddenly lost its meaning. Jonathan was left alone, feeling an emptiness that no luxurious decor or expensive possessions could fill. His attempts to build a relationship with Andrew were met with a wall of resentment. Andrew wasn't looking for a father, especially not one who had abandoned his mother and left them to live in poverty. Their meetings were tense, and although Jonathan tried to make amends for the mistakes of the past, his son refused to accept him. Andrew had grown up without knowing a father's love or support, and now saw Jonathan as just a man trying to buy forgiveness with money. Jonathan realized that his wealth no longer held the power he once thought it did. He offered Andrew financial help, hoping to at least compensate for the years of absence, but this only pushed his son further away. You think money can fix everything, Andrew once said bitterly. But it won't replace the years you weren't there. You weren't with my mom when she needed help. You didn't see me grow up. You don't know what I've been through. And now you think you can buy my forgiveness? These words hit Jonathan harder than any accusation. He suddenly understood how far he was from grasping what truly mattered in life. Everything he had known, everything he had considered important, had crumbled before him like a house of cards. The money and success he had sacrificed everything for couldn't bring back his wife or his son. In desperation, Jonathan began to realize that the only way to redemption was not through wealth, but through a change in himself. He began seeking ways to show Andrew that his intentions were sincere, that he was willing to do whatever it took to earn at least a shred of trust. To do so, he had to reevaluate his life, stop trying to buy love, and start from scratch, with simple, genuine actions. He began helping charitable organizations that worked with young people in difficult life situations, hoping that through this, he could partially atone for his mistakes. He realized that the long road to forgiveness started with honesty and humility. Jonathan's story ended with him losing the love of his wife and the trust of his son. He realized that behind the outward glitter of his life lay unforgivable mistakes, and now he faced the hardest path, the path of redemption, and the hope that one day Andrew might forgive him. But Jonathan knew that this would be a long and painful process that would require not just effort, but a complete transformation of himself. After Laura's departure, Jonathan's home fell into silence. The spacious rooms, once filled with warmth and life, now seemed cold and lifeless. Everything he had built, his career, his wealth, his comfort, suddenly lost its meaning. Jonathan was left alone, feeling an emptiness that no luxurious decor or expensive possessions could fill. His attempts to build a relationship with Andrew were met with a wall of resentment. Andrew wasn't looking for a father, especially not one who had abandoned his mother and left them to live in poverty. Their meetings were tense, and although Jonathan tried to make amends for the mistakes of the past, his son refused to accept him. Andrew had grown up without knowing a father's love or support, and now saw Jonathan as just a man trying to buy forgiveness with money. Jonathan realized that his wealth no longer held the power he once thought it did. He offered Andrew financial help, hoping to at least compensate for the years of absence, but this only pushed his son further away. You think money can fix everything, Andrew once said bitterly. But it won't replace the years you weren't there. You weren't with my mom when she needed help. You didn't see me grow up. You don't know what I've been through. And now you think you can buy my forgiveness." These words hit Jonathan harder than any accusation. He suddenly understood how far he was from grasping what truly mattered in life. Everything he had known, everything he had considered important, had crumbled before him like a house of cards. The money and success he had sacrificed everything for couldn't bring back his wife or his son. In desperation, Jonathan began to realize that the only way to redemption was not through wealth, but through a change in himself. He began seeking ways to show Andrew that his intentions were sincere, that he was willing to do whatever it took to earn at least a shred of trust. To do so, he had to reevaluate his life, stop trying to buy love, and start from scratch, with simple, genuine actions. He began helping charitable organizations that worked with young people in difficult life situations, hoping that through this, he could partially atone for his mistakes. He realized that the long road to forgiveness started with honesty and humility. Jonathan's story ended with him losing the love of his wife and the trust of his son. He realized that behind the outward glitter of his life lay unforgivable mistakes, and now he faced the hardest path, the path of redemption, and the hope that one day Andrew might forgive him. But Jonathan knew that this would be a long and painful process that would require not just effort, but a complete transformation of himself.